I blocked my husband 2 hours before boarding a plane to the coast, the way someone shuts a door gently but firmly, knowing the draft will rattle the frame when you're already too far down the hall to turn back. It was supposed to be 7 days of quiet, the sea, a paperback, a rented bicycle. When I returned, the house felt staged, like a hotel room the maid had just finished neat, scentless, not mine. His shoes were lined like soldiers. His toothbrush angled toward the drain. His phone charger coiled into a perfect loop. He was gone, and it looked as though he had never meant to be found. The week before I left, the sky in our city held a stubborn shade of pewter, the kind that made the afternoons feel like late evening. I had been carrying a tiredness with me that winter, the heavy, granular kind that settles into the elbows and behind the eyes. Work took more than it gave. The pulse oximeters at my hospital blinked red like tiny lighthouses. The charting never ended. The night shift took my dreams and swapped them with fluorescent ceilings and the thrum of vents. At home, silence set like plaster. My husband, Evan, had a gift for filling silence with certainty. He organized drawers, tinkered with an app idea he swore would be the next big thing, slid receipts into zippered pouches. He kept his voice even in the way people with power practice on their commute, rehearsing calm like a language. He was the kind of person who made lists about lists. He called it being deliberate. I called it building a life that could be measured, weighed, and shown. I am a Black woman who learned early that showing wasn't always enough. The year we moved into our bungalow, the realtor smiled through me and aimed her sentences at him, even when the down payment came from my account. When the mailman asked for the homeowner, he looked around me, as if the title deed could only sit in one hand and not the other. When we installed a security camera, the app labeled my face with a question mark for weeks while it confidently recognized Evan from any angle. In our neighborhood newsroom online, someone wrote that a suspicious woman had been walking near the park at dawn. The picture showed my jogging jacket and my braids swinging. The post stayed up for days. He said these were glitches, people being people, small things you brush off like lint. He offered rationality the way some men offer flowers. But the small things had sharp edges that cut along the same line. I felt it each time a stranger's eyes slid past me to find him, each time a bank representative spoke over me on speakerphone until I raised my voice and felt the room shift, seeing not a customer but a stereotype they were taught to fear. We agreed I needed a break. My shifts had doubled. My mother's voice on the phone was thin with distance. My heart beat like it was trying to sprint past my ribs. So I booked a week on the coast, a little guest house with a balcony and a kitchen that could fit only one person at a time. 7 days without charts, alarms, or explanations. I told him the dates. I sent the confirmation. He said he'd be swamped anyway. His app pitch deck had meetings stacked like dominoes. We sat on opposite sides of the couch, scrolling past each other. The night before I left, a small argument cracked open like a fault line. It was nothing and it was everything. A charge from a cafe I didn't recognize, a defensive shrug, my tired voice landing wrong, his measured tone tightening. I wanted to be unreachable. I wanted to remove his commentary from the soundtrack of my breath. So 2 hours before my flight, standing in the slanted morning light, I blocked him on my phone. I told myself it was temporary, just a membrane between me and the world so I could heal. I didn't tell myself that something about the neatness of his certainty had started to scare me. On the plane, I watched the clouds peel away from the wing like foam. I imagined us laughing again. I imagined the ache in my chest loosening like a knot. I saw myself come home with sea air sewn into my hair and a softness I had not felt in months. All the while, the number with his name beside it was quiet by force. I slept. The ocean is an honest audience. It receives you without flattery. Each morning, I walked the shoreline until the wind gave my cheeks a sting, then I brewed coffee so strong it made time feel sharper. I wrote lists that looked nothing like his, smells I wanted to remember, sounds that made me feel human, the sudden way gulls argued overhead. My phone became an appliance instead of a tether. I told myself I would unblock him on the flight home, that he would be waiting with that careful smile, the one that tried to smooth over everything. On day 4, a woman at the guest house smiled at me over the mailbox and asked if I was there to write or to leave something behind. It was the kind of coastal question people ask when they have watched grief unpack its suitcase on too many porches. I said I was there to rest. She nodded like she knew rest was never simple. On the 7th morning, I folded the sheet corners the way my mother taught me to make a bed feel purposeful. At the airport, I placed my phone in airplane mode and felt the familiar pressure of a world held at arm's length. I imagined the scene at home, his laptop open, his dishes in the sink, his new hobby scattered on the dining table like a translation nobody asked for. I imagined the fight dissolving into a practical conversation. I unlocked my phone in the taxi and hesitated over his contact. I told myself I'd wait until I reached the front door, like a small penance for my stubbornness. The house received me with that hotel room stillness. The cushions stood to attention. The rug was brushed in a single direction. On the foyer console, a white envelope sat like a square of silence. There was no name on it. Inside, a business card, an attorney's office downtown, a time written on the back for 2 afternoons earlier, and a post-it with a 6-digit code. It looked like a scavenger hunt designed by someone who found games easier than truth. In the bedroom, his clothes were arranged by color as always, but the absence showed in the negative space. His favorite jacket was gone. The leather strap watch that sat like a coin on the nightstand was missing. The framed photo from our first holiday leaned against the lamp with a thin film of dust across it, as if a finger had hovered and then withdrawn. When I tried his number, the call slid into a metallic vacancy. The banking app asked for the 2-factor code and then greeted me with an account balance that felt like a punch. Transfers had been made steadily over the week, each small enough to slip under thresholds, each labeled with innocuous names. In our joint email, confirmations smiled at me from accounts I didn't recognize. Our emergency fund blinked 0. The mortgage autopay had been paused. The home insurance cancellation notice sat unopened, polite and lethal. I drove to the police station with my hands at 10 and 2, my jaw grinding against the question that refused to resolve. Who had I come home to before, if the man who made lists had made one without me at the top? The officer at the desk listened with the gaze that schemes, like a stone tossed across water. He took notes in a pattern that felt like choreographed sympathy. He asked if we had fought, if I had blocked him, if I had a temper, if there was anyone who might corroborate. He spoke as if my report was an attitude to be managed, not a reality that required action. I watched his pen hesitate in the notable places, then scratch harder in the places where I mentioned my own anger. I felt the old shape of the room around me, the one where a black woman is both witness and suspect. I handed over the envelope and saw him glance at the attorney's card with a flicker that could have been interest or irritation. He said these cases were tricky. He said people leave all the time. He said adults have a right to vanish. He suggested I go home and rest, then contact a lawyer. The world narrowed to a needle's eye, and I threaded myself through it. The attorney's office was on the 12th floor, the kind of suite where the plants never wilt and the air smells like lemony wood. The receptionist looked at my face, then down at her screen, then over my shoulder as if the version of me that paid on time might appear in a cleaner coat. A legal aide led me to a conference room with glass walls that reflected me back in duplicate, nurse's badge still clipped to the tote, hair pulled into the braid I used when I needed to move fast, eyes that did not blink enough to be polite. The attorney arrived with a file already open. My name was circled. Evan's name was underlined. On the table, he placed a document packet that unfurled like a trick. There were signed forms appointing him as counsel, notarized statements withdrawing from our joint ventures, and a letter drafted by Evan that looked like a lifeboat he had constructed in secret. It explained that he was relocating to focus on his company, that our marriage had been irretrievably strained, that I had chosen separation by blocking, that he wished me well. It named me as volatile and lyrical, careful language. It proposed a division of assets that had already been executed. There were screenshots of neighborhood posts where my morning runs had been described as prowling. There were bank transfers justified as business expenses. There were emails from a burner account addressed to him from an alias pretending to be me, full of phrases I would never write, cut and pasted into a collage of menace. And there were records of calls I had not made, time-stamped during my flight. Something inside me managed to stand up even as my body remained seated. I asked how a man could move money like this without a conversation, how a letter could substitute for presence, how a claim of volatility could turn an empty house into a verdict. The attorney said the system has lanes and he had chosen one and run fast. The law sometimes cared more about paperwork than people. In the neatness of the forms, I recognized the shape of his certainty, now weaponized. He had planned his vanishing with the same care he used to arrange receipts. I found a thread that had not yet been cut. The smart lock app logged entries and exits with timestamps. Our camera caught strawlight slivers of life even when faces were turned. I pulled the data into a spreadsheet, a nurse's way of diagnosing a hemorrhage in a different kind of body. I saw his last exit marked midweek, a suitcase-shaped shadow leaving at dawn, a car I didn't recognize idling at the curb. I saw who had come to help. His business partner, a woman whose LinkedIn had a smile so bright it felt like a defense. I found a storage unit rented 3 months earlier. I followed a breadcrumb trail of subscriptions canceled, insurances reduced, memberships ended. When I reported this to the detective assigned to my case, he nodded toward the clock more than the facts. He said it looked like a marital dispute and not a crime. He suggested that if I wanted to pursue fraud, I would need to provide proof in a format the bank preferred. He reminded me of the penalties for filing knowingly false statements. I watched my own breath fog and clear on the window as he spoke and thought of every friend who had told me that when you are Black and a woman, the burden of proof arrives preloaded onto your shoulders. I built my proof anyway. I compiled logs. I mapped transactions to GPS pings. I documented that during my flight, someone had used my email from our home IP after I had passed through security. I articulated, meticulously, that even if our love had thinned to threads, there were still knots he had cut instead of untying. I delivered the file to the bank manager who had once mispronounced my name so many times that I adopted his version for a year just to get through meetings. He reviewed the documents and suggested an internal investigation would be launched. The phrase landed like a door closing softly. That evening, a message arrived from an unlisted number. It was a single line with coordinates and a date 3 days prior. I recognized the coordinates, the marina south of the city. I drove there with my body ringing like a struck glass. In the parking lot, a boat rental office posted a list of departures and returns. I found his name next to a departure and a blank space where the return time should be. A staff member told me a storm had rolled in hard that afternoon, the kind that turns edges of water into teeth. A capsized dinghy had been found at dusk, no body recovered. The Coast Guard had suspended the search by nightfall. I stood at the dock and felt the world tilt. In the middle of his controlled exit, in the design of his vanishing, an element unaccounted for had ripped through the plan like a current. Whether he had intended the boat as a gesture or a gate, the result was the same. The version of him that wrote letters instead of staying had been swallowed by a silence too wide to measure. Death without a body is a question that never ends. People prefer spectacles that confirm. They crave a casket to lean their grief against. Without that, suspicion becomes the backbone of every conversation. Neighbors asked in careful tones whether I was coping. Reporters called because the story had angles that travel well: a husband gone after a wife blocks him, money missing, a boat, a storm. Comment sections the color of bruises decided that I was either a cunning widow or a foolish woman who should have seen the signs. The middle ground, the one where betrayal and tragedy mix in a solvent that resists language, drew little interest. The police closed no case. The bank opened one and then placed it in a queue so long it might as well have been a graveyard. The insurance company, relieved by the cancellation he had pushed through, named the loss outside their responsibility. The mortgage company, gleeful in its own way, reopened the auto pay and added fees. I sold the car we shared and rode the bus to the hospital for a season. The receptionist at the clinic asked me if I had considered moving to a safer neighborhood, and then lowered her eyes when she realized what she was implying about the one where my name had been called suspicious. The systems arranged themselves to observe my pain rather than alleviate it. Grief and rage lived side by side on my kitchen counter. I learned to cook with both in the room. On the mornings when the house felt too large, I closed doors until it matched my size. On the evenings when the ache was unignorable, I turned on the porch light and left it burning until dawn, not for him, but for the younger version of myself who believed that light could send a message to any distance. I told myself that I had been betrayed not only by a husband's choice, but by the systems that watched me bleed as if it were a sport. Friends gathered around me the way experienced hikers form a circle against wind. They brought casseroles that tasted like efforts to speak the unspeakable. One colleague, whose brother had been swallowed by a custody labyrinth made cruel by bias, handed me a list of legal aid clinics that believed women who looked like us without requiring us to cry prettily. I met with a nonprofit lawyer who spoke with the measured kindness of someone who has learned to step gently around trauma without avoiding it. She told me the path forward would be long but not impossible. She said that sometimes justice is not a verdict so much as a decision to keep telling the truth even when no one returns your call. With her guidance, I filed for restitution from accounts that could be traced to the transfers. It was an administrative victory that felt like a thimble dipped into the sea. I requested data from the marina and cross-referenced it with weather reports to satisfy the possibility that the boat accident had been staged. I worried that grief had made me a detective with no crime to solve, or worse, that it had made me believe in crimes everywhere to avoid the simpler truth that people sometimes choose to leave and are then removed by forces more indifferent than any human betrayal. I also recognized that if his plan had been to disappear, then a storm had only hastened what he had already begun. The ending was not mine to write. My life still was. Spring came in earnest. The cherry trees on our street spilled petals onto the sidewalks like congratulations I hadn't earned. I packed his remaining clothes into boxes and labeled them with facts rather than feelings: shirts, cold weather; shoes, formal, miscellany. I found the paper cranes we had folded on a rainy anniversary, their wings creased by hope, and I let them fly into the recycling bin with the rest of the paper truths. In the empty of our closet, I heard no revelation, only relief. I changed the smart lock code and removed his profile, not as erasure, but as acknowledgement that the ghost of his certainty no longer sat at my table. One afternoon, I stood at the hospital window and watched a family gather in the parking lot, arms around each other, a circle formed to receive news. I thought about the many ways people vanish, into anger, into fear, into debt, into the plain geometry of distance. I thought about how often women like me are asked to prove our worth even as we hold the world's emergencies in our hands, how often we are told to calm down when what we are doing is finally, precisely, telling the truth about pain. Retention is a word we used at the hospital for keeping staff from burning out. It is also a word I learned to use for the parts of myself I refuse to misplace: my competence, my humor, my capacity to love without self-erasure. I began volunteering with a group that helps women navigate financial abuse, the kind that hides in spreadsheets and emergency funds, the kind that can be carried out by someone who smiles for photos like a profession. We sat in church basements and community rooms with bad lighting, and we mapped out accounts and escape routes. We talked about the particular ache of not being believed, and we rehearsed the sentences we would repeat even when the officers took notes about our tone before our facts. We taught each other to document everything, not as paranoia, but as a way to leave breadcrumb trails for ourselves. We sat with the complexity of mourning someone who had harmed us or left us or both. When the bank finally reversed a fraction of the transfers, the letter mentioned policies and exceptions without apology. I took the small victory and placed it on the shelf with other small victories, learning a new recipe, sleeping through the night, running past the park with my head high, no longer adjusting my pace because a comment section had once tried to write me down to the size of its own imagination. I opened new accounts in my name only. I made a list, not of everything I wanted to control, but of what I could accept and what I would no longer entertain. My lists looked different from his. They were not defense mechanisms, but vows. I did not unblock him. There was no number to reach. Even if there had been, my heart did not need the echo. If the ocean is an honest audience, then so is the future. It has no interest in costumes. When I return to the coast now, I stand at the edge and let the wind sting me awake. I think about how I tried to protect my rest and inadvertently revealed a truth that had been waiting behind a wall of politeness. Blocking him had felt like a small rebellion. It became the boundary that allowed me to see the floor plan of his planned escape. People ask whether I forgive him. Forgiveness, I have learned, is not a switch. It is a landscape you can sometimes walk without stumbling. Some days, I can say I forgive the man who could not tell the truth and instead built a paper boat and folded himself into it. On other days, I forgive only myself for not seeing sooner, and I forgive myself for how long I will need to practice that. The rest belongs to the water. I still keep the porch light on some nights, not for him, but for the woman who returned from a week of ocean and found a museum where her marriage should have been. She knows now that the systems that failed to protect her are not mirrors but walls, and she has learned the grip it takes to climb. She knows that some losses are final even when the law remains undecided. She knows that vanishing can be a choice and a consequence at the same time. If you have ever loved someone who taught you to doubt the shape of your own reality, you know this question already. If betrayal breaks you open and the world rushes in with salt and wind, which part of you chooses what to keep and what to let drift out with the tide?